Richard here. Grab a seat. This one starts loud and gets quiet, and you're going to want to catch every bit of both. The whole town of Sundown Flats was laughing at Bertie Calhoun, all 20-some of the folks who happened to be standing along Main Street that wet spring morning, and not one of them lifted a single finger to help her. She was up to her knees in mud behind her father's wagon, hauling on a rope tied to a mule that had gone down on its side in a flooded rut and would not, for love or money, get back up. And the crowd that had gathered to watch found the whole spectacle of a big woman struggling in the muck considerably more entertaining than they found it worth assisting. Then Wyatt Belrose, who'd ridden into Sundown Flats not 20 minutes before on a horse the whole town had already started whispering about on account of how fine it was, swung down off that horse without a word to anybody, walked straight past the laughing crowd, and climbed down into that same mud beside Bertie Calhoun like the muck wasn't there at all. The laughing stopped almost immediately. Not because anybody felt ashamed of themselves, not yet anyway, but because a stranger nobody recognized had just done something none of them had been willing to do. And a crowd that's been caught enjoying somebody's misery doesn't much care for an audience to its own meanness. Now I want you to understand exactly how bad that morning had already gotten before Wyatt Belrose ever rode into town. Because the mud wasn't even the worst part of it. Bertie Calhoun was 28 years old, the daughter of the town's blacksmith, a big, capable woman with 4 arms thick from years of helping her father at the forge, and a face that had gone hard and careful sometime around her 20th birthday, after one too many seasons of being the joke at every town gathering. She'd been hauling a wagon load of feed back from the mill that morning, when the spring rains, which had turned half of Main Street into standing water, and the low crossing past the church into something closer to a swamp, caught her mule mid-crossing. The animal had panicked, gone down hard on its side in the rut, and refused every effort Bertie made to get it back up, thrashing just enough each time to make the whole business dangerous, kicking up mud and standing water in every direction. A handful of men had been standing under the awning of Pruitt's dry goods store when it happened, watching the whole thing unfold. And instead of wading in to help a struggling woman with a half-ton animal in a flooded street, they had done what men in towns like that one too often do when the person struggling happens to be a woman they'd already decided wasn't worth much regard. They'd laughed. One of them, a loud, red-faced man named Carl Tully, who ran the feed mill and had spent a solid decade making Bertie Calhoun's life smaller through 1,000 careless comments, had actually called out across the street, loud enough for half the town to hear, asking if she planned on dragging that mule out by herself, same as she dragged everything else, on account of no man in 3 counties being foolish enough to help her with much of anything. The crowd had laughed at that, the way crowds do when somebody louder gives them permission to be cruel without feeling cruel themselves. And Bertie Calhoun had stood there in that mud, soaked through, exhausted, her arms shaking from hauling on a rope a mule 3 times her weight had no intention of responding to, and had heard every single word of it, and kept working anyway, because stopping to cry in front of that crowd would have cost her something she wasn't willing to give them. That is exactly the moment Wyatt Belrose rode into town. He didn't ask anybody what was happening. He didn't need to. One look at a struggling animal and a soaked, exhausted woman fighting it alone while a crowd of grown men stood dry and laughing under an awning told him everything he needed to know about Sundown Flats in about 4 seconds flat. And he didn't care for what it told him. He swung down off his horse, walked past Carl Tully without so much as a glance in his direction, and climbed down into the mud beside Bertie Calhoun. "What's her trouble?" he said, nodding at the mule. his voice pitched low and even, the way a man talks when he's already half a step into solving a problem rather than discussing it. Birdie, startled enough by the sudden presence of a stranger in the mud beside her that she nearly lost her footing, looked at him with an expression caught somewhere between suspicion and disbelief. "She went down in the rut and won't get up. Tried everything I know." "Show me what you've tried," Wyatt said, and waited. "Now, folks, I want you to sit with this part, because this is where the whole story turns. Right here in the mud, with half the town watching." Birdie was so used to being the spectacle, so braced for whatever cruel angle was coming next, that for one long second she simply stared at him, waiting for the joke, waiting for him to be one more man who'd help just enough to make a show of it before turning it into another story told at her expense. It didn't come. He stood there, mud past his fine boots, waiting on her answer, same as he'd ask a question of any working hand he respected. She showed him. She'd been pulling the rope from the front, trying to drag the animal forward and up, the same way most folks try, and fail, to right a downed mule, treating the whole problem as a matter of brute strength rather than understanding. Wyatt watched her demonstrate it, watched the mule thrash and resist exactly the way it had been thrashing and resisting for the better part of 20 minutes. And then he did something that made the watching crowd go a good deal quieter than the laughing had been. He didn't reach for the rope at all. He crouched down low in the mud beside the animal's head, ignoring the flailing legs entirely, and laid his palm flat against the mule's neck. The same unhurried, confident touch of a man who'd spent a great deal of his life around frightened animals and had long ago stopped being afraid of them. "She's not stuck," he said. "She's terrified. There's a difference. And it changes everything about how you fix it." If you're enjoying this one so far, stick around, because we're only getting started. And I think the next part is going to surprise you, same as it surprised half of Sundown Flats that morning. Go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't, and drop your city down in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Birdie watched him work, and despite everything, the mud, the cold, the laughing crowd, still gathered under that awning waiting to see what foolishness a stranger's interference would cause next. She found herself paying closer attention than she had to almost anything in years. Wyatt kept his hand steady against the mule's neck, speaking low and even, the words themselves nearly meaningless, the tone doing all the actual work, the same patient register a person uses to talk a spooked child down off a high fence. Slowly, over the better part of 2 long minutes, the animal's thrashing eased, its breathing slowed, and the wild, white-edged look in its eye softened into something closer to exhaustion than panic. "Now," Wyatt said quietly, not moving his hand, "we don't pull her up. We give her room to choose it herself. Animal this scared, you fight her, she fights back twice as hard out of pure terror. You give her room and patience, she generally decides standing up is her own idea, and then she does it without half the thrashing." Birdie Calhoun, who had spent a decade quietly nursing every sick and injured animal her father's customers brought through the forge, who had a gift for doctoring livestock that the whole town somehow managed to overlook in favor of commenting on her size at every available opportunity, found herself looking at this stranger with something other than suspicion for the first time since he'd climbed down into that mud. "You're talking about her like she's reasoning it through," Birdie said. "Near enough as makes no difference," Wyatt said. "Fear makes an animal stupid, same as it does a person, near as I can tell. Settle the fear, the animal generally finds its own good sense again." He glanced sideways at her, mud-streaked and steady. "You knew that already, near as I can tell by the way you just nodded instead of arguing with me." "I doctor animals for half this county," Bertie said, a little defensive, a little surprised at her own honesty. "Have done for years. Folks bring me their sick stock quiet, round the back of my father's forge, on account of they don't care to be seen needin' help from the woman they laugh at on Main Street." Something shifted in Wyatt Belrose's face, the same grim recognition Bertie would come to know well over the following months. The look of a decent man working out exactly how unkind a place could be without ever once raising its voice about it. "That's so," he said quietly. He looked back at the mule, easing now under his patient hand, its legs finally settling instead of flailing. "Strikes me as a damn poor use of a gift. This whole town hiding it round the back of a forge on account of being too proud or too foolish to say it plain in front of everybody else." The mule chose that exact moment to gather itself and stand, slow and unsteady but upright, shaking the worst of the mud from its coat, and the crowd under the awning, watching the whole scene resolve itself without a single drop of the chaos or foolishness they'd clearly been hoping for, went very quiet indeed. Carl Tully, never a man inclined to let a quiet moment stay quiet for long, called out from under the awning, his voice carrying that same careless cruelty as before, asking the stranger if he made a habit of climbing into the mud after every big girl who couldn't manage her own livestock. Wyatt Belrose stood up slowly, mud dripping from his sleeves, and looked across the street at Carl Tully with an expression that had nothing soft left in it at all. "I make a habit," he said, his voice carrying clean and even across the whole wet street, "of helping anybody whose animal's in trouble, same as any decent man ought to. What I don't make a habit of is standing dry under an awning, laughing at a woman doing the work alone that every one of you was too lazy or too cowardly to lend a hand with." He looked around at the rest of the crowd, slow and deliberate. "I've been in this town 20 minutes, and I've already learned considerably more about the lot of you than I expect you'd care for a stranger knowing." Nobody under that awning had a single word to say back to that. Carl Tully's face went the particular shade of red that comes from being publicly correct about nothing and publicly wrong about everything at once, and the crowd that had gathered to enjoy Bertie Calhoun's struggle began, piece by piece, to drift away from the scene rather than stand there being looked at by a stranger who'd just shown every one of them exactly what kind of people they'd chosen to be that morning. Bertie stood in the mud, soaked through, mule finally upright and steady beside her, and looked at Wyatt Belrose with an expression she hadn't worn in longer than she could remember. Not gratitude, exactly, though there was plenty of that buried in it, but something closer to simple astonishment, the particular astonishment of being defended by somebody who hadn't been asked to do it and hadn't seemed to weigh the cost of doing it before he did. "You didn't have to say all that," she said. "No," Wyatt agreed. "I didn't have to. I wanted to, on account of it being true, and on account of nobody else in this whole street seemed inclined to say it." He looked at the mule, then back at her. "Now, you're soaked through, and that animal's still shaken, and I expect she could use a proper looking over before you take her any further today. You mind if I walk you both back to wherever you're headed? I find I'm curious to see this forge of yours, and whatever else this town's been keeping quiet round the back of it. Now, folks, I want you to lean in close here, because what happened over the following weeks is the real heart of this story, even more than that mud puddle was." Wyatt Belrose, it turned out, was passing through Sundown Flats on his way to a cattle operation 2 counties over, where he'd been hired on as a horse trainer, a job that would have him settled in that part of the territory for the better part of a year at minimum. He found reasons, over the following weeks, to extend his stay in Sundown Flats considerably longer than the few days he'd originally planned, and most of those reasons the whole town came to understand soon enough traced straight back to the blacksmith's daughter and the quiet, overlooked gift she'd spent a decade keeping hidden round the back of her father's forge. He started bringing animals to her directly, openly, in full view of Main Street, rather than sneaking them round back the way the rest of the town had always done. A lame horse here, a colicky mule there, and once, memorably, a rancher's prize bull that had gotten itself tangled in wire and gone half wild with pain and fear by the time it reached her. Bertie worked on every one of them in plain daylight, in front of whoever cared to watch, because Wyatt made a point, every single time, of standing beside her while she did it, the same unhurried, respectful presence he'd brought to that mud puddle on his first morning in town, making it considerably harder for anybody to laugh at a woman whose work a man like Wyatt Belrose clearly thought worth witnessing in the open. It took the better part of 2 months for the town's opinion to shift the way water shifts a riverbed, slow and unglamorous and undeniable once you looked back at how far it had moved. Folks who'd laughed at Bertie Calhoun in March were riding out to her forge by May with their sick stock in broad daylight, paying her properly rather than slipping coins to her quietly and pretending the transaction hadn't happened. And Carl Tully, who never did manage a proper apology, at least had the sense to keep his commentary to himself from that morning forward, having learned the hard way that Sundown Flats now contained at least one man willing to say plainly, in front of God and Main Street both, exactly what kind of person he was. It was on a warm evening in early June, with the mud from that first morning long since dried and washed away, that Wyatt found Bertie at the forge after closing, the fire banked low, the day's work done, and asked her the question he'd apparently been turning over since the day he'd climbed down into that flooded rut beside her. "I've been offered the training position permanent," he said. "Rancher wants me settled here through the winter and beyond, if I'm willing." He turned his hat over in his hands, the same nervous habit she'd noticed in him more than once over the past 2 months. "I find I'm willing, Bertie, on the condition that I'm not settling here alone." Bertie set down the tool she'd been cleaning and looked at him steady, the same careful, bracing look she'd given him that first morning in the mud, the look of a woman who'd spent a decade expecting the cruel ending hiding under every kind sentence. It didn't come this time either. "I watched this whole town overlook the finest gift I've seen in years," Wyatt said, "on account of caring more about your size than your hands. And I climbed into that mud the first morning I rode in here, mostly because I couldn't stand watching it happen one more time without doing something about it. I've spent 2 months since watching you heal animals nobody else in 3 counties can save, and I've come to a conclusion I don't expect will surprise you much, given how plain I've been about most things." He held her gaze. "I'd be a fool to ride on to the next county and leave the best thing I've found in this whole territory standing alone at a forge nobody bothered to properly thank." "That's not a question," Bertie said, though her voice had gone considerably softer than it had been a moment before. "No," Wyatt agreed. "I expect it isn't. Will you marry me, Bertie Calhoun? Not on account of pity, and not on account of being the only woman in this town fool enough to climb into mud beside a stranger's mule. On account of you being the finest, steadiest, most capable person I've met in this whole territory, and on account of I don't aim to spend the rest of my life finding that out from a distance." Bertie Calhoun, who had spent 28 years bracing for the cruel ending hidden inside every kind word this town had ever offered her, found, for the second time that spring, that there was no cruel ending hiding underneath this one either. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Wyatt, I'll marry you." They married that autumn at the same forge where Wyatt had first asked to see what the town had been keeping quiet round the back of it, with half of Sundown Flats in attendance. The very same crowd that had once stood laughing under an awning, now standing respectfully in their Sunday best, because a town's memory is short when it comes to its own shame, and considerably longer when it comes to deciding, after the fact, that it always secretly admired the person it once mocked. Carl Tully did not attend, having found business elsewhere that conveniently kept him occupied the whole day through, and nobody in Sundown Flats much minded his absence. Within 3 years, Bertie Calhoun Belrose's practice had grown into the most trusted animal doctoring operation in 4 counties, with ranchers riding considerable distances to bring her their most troubled stock. The same gift the town had once hidden round the back of a forge, now bringing folks from every direction straight through the front door, asking for her by name. Wyatt never did stop telling the story of that first muddy morning, same as Caleb never stopped telling Hazel she'd make somebody lucky, and every single time he told it, he ended it the exact same way, looking at his wife with the same steady regard he'd shown her in that flooded rut on Main Street. "Best decision I ever made," he'd say, "climbing down into that mud. Everybody else in this whole town was standing dry, and I was the only fool smart enough to get wet." Well, that's the story, friends. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't standing up to a crowd with words. It's simply climbing down into the mud beside somebody everybody else decided wasn't worth the trouble. Tell me down in the comments if you've ever had somebody do that for you. Climb down into your hard moment without being asked. And don't forget to drop your city so I can see how far this one travels tonight. I've got plenty more of these waiting for you, so subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one. This is Richard. Take care of each other out there.